All right, let's continue with chapter 16 now. So, others before Darwin thought about evolution and that organisms could change through time, and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was one of the first to do this. Um, so, in that sense, he was ahead of his time. Now, however, the mechanism he came up with to explain how things change through time has been shown to not be correct. And you can think of this as what's called the inheritance of acquired traits. And so he essentially said that organisms would strive to survive and would sort of become modified or modify themselves. And the one example he would give is, say, with a giraffe and how a giraffe would stretch its neck to reach higher leaves, and in stretching its neck would get longer, and then it could pass that on to its offspring, who would then stretch their neck even more, et cetera, until you arrive at this organism with a really long neck. Um, a more absurd example of that might be something of if someone, when they're younger, maybe lost a finger or something, so they only had 9 fingers. It would say that when they had kids, their kids would only have 9 fingers, because again, that's a trait they've acquired, and so they would pass it on to their offspring. Um, we know that's not correct because essentially with evolution, as we now know with genetics, that these traits are in our genes, and our genes are what are passed down. And so a trait like having 10 fingers is part of our genes, and so whether you lose one or not doesn't matter. Your kids are going to have 10. Um, and with an example like the giraffe's neck, it's not that individual giraffes stretch out their neck, it's that you have variation amongst giraffes, and some are taller and some are shorter. Some have longer necks, some have shorter necks. And so essentially, if there is strong selection for longer necks, that is, it's really important to reach those higher leaves, then those are the individuals that will survive. The ones with shorter necks won't survive. And so these guys will pass on their genes, and in the next generation, they might have somewhat slightly longer necks. Again, it's because of differential survival, not because of them striving and trying to stretch their necks. Um, all right, another influential thinker on Darwin was Malthus. He studied the population growth of humans and noted that human populations have the ability to grow exponentially. That is, to have really rapid population growth. But he believed that this essentially um, could outstrip, or the population could outgrow its resource supply. He said the population can grow exponentially, but resources at best would only increase at a linear rate, and they would eventually overreach their resource supply, their food supply. And so that would mean that the populations have to come down. They cannot just grow indefinitely. Um, a major influence on him was the fact that this was the 1840s and 50s, and the Irish potato famine is occurring at this time. The food supply in Ireland is severely limited because of the failure of much of the potato crop, and so the population was shrinking. People were starving, and then, of course, people were leaving because there was no food, and coming to the United States, for example. So essentially, Darwin surmised that, well, if this can happen to human populations, surely it must happen to wild populations. That is, any kind of organism out there, any kind of species has the ability to grow rapidly, but they are ultimately limited by their resource base. And so this would bring out a certain amount of competition between those individuals, and some would survive and some wouldn't. Okay. Now, people for centuries, millennia if not, have been doing artificial selection, including Darwin. He kept pigeons, and pigeon breeders are like to take your typical pigeon and through many generations of selection come up with these rather interesting phenotypes. Um, and so Darwin thought, well, gosh, if people can take one species and change it into these multiple forms, why wouldn't nature be able to do the same thing? Um, all right. So from all this, his own observations and these thinkers, he started developing his ideas on evolution by natural selection. So essentially, populations again have the ability to grow rapidly, produce lots of offspring, but that brings about a struggle amongst them, competition between them for limited resources like food and space. There is variation amongst these offspring, particularly if they are the result of sexual reproduction, like these juvenile frogs here, these tadpoles. There will be variation amongst them, and because of that struggle, that competition, some of those variants will be better adapted than others. So some will make it, and many of them will not. They will die for want of food, lack of finding food. Others will just be eaten by predators. They might be somewhat slower swimmers, so they're more easily caught. So essentially, those that are better adapted to their surroundings will be the ones that survive. And so it's these adaptations that help organisms survive, whether it's having thick fur and white fur like the Arctic fox and small ears that help it retain heat in that cold environment. This a reptile with this long tongue that allows it to catch food from relatively far away. It's a um, um, I believe this is a gecko, and they're relatively slow moving. They don't move very fast, but they sort of just slowly creep up on something, and then all of a sudden they can zap their tongue out there really quickly. Here we have this jackrabbit, and has really large ears that can help it hear things that are perhaps predators that are trying to sneak up on it. But it lives in a dry climate, and those ears also are adapted to allowing it to release heat into its surroundings, sort of like the large ears of an elephant. Here's another reptile that blends in with these dead, dry leaves, and so it basically uses camouflage to hide from predators and also to be able to sneak up on what it wants to eat. So again, you can have camouflage. Here we have an interesting situation with these snakes. One of them is poisonous and one is not. Um, and perhaps you already know it's the one on the left that is poisonous. This one is not. The saying is red on yellow, kill a fellow, red on black, friend of Jack. So this is the safe one, and this guy is the dangerous one. And what the dangerous one essentially is doing is the opposite of camouflage. It's doing what's called aposematic coloring. It's the same as what poisonous frogs do. They're standing out and advertising that they are toxic and you don't want to, or they're a poisonous snake, you don't want to mess with them. The other one has an adaptation that we know as mimicry, where it essentially is attempting, well, again, it's not striving, but selection has favored individuals that sort of look like the poisonous one, which helps them out by making other animals think they're poisonous when they're really not, so they stay away from it. So you might say the harmless one is hitching a ride on the um, toxicity of the poisonous snake through this process of mimicry. So we have this variation, you have particular conditions in the environment, and it's favoring some types over another. So this moth down here that blends in with the lichens on this tree is very hard to see, whereas the other one is much easier to see. In a different environment where there are no lichens and the tree surfaces are darker, this one would blend in, and so it just depends on the context. And so here, the one that blends in is going to survive better, reproduce, and have offspring, so it's going to have what we call higher fitness or higher Darwinian fitness. That is, those individuals that are able to survive and reproduce best have higher Darwinian fitness. It's not necessarily related to your physical fitness, although it can be. It's more specifically, again, how many offspring you have and how many essentially of your genes that you pass on is Darwinian fitness. And so putting this all together, we get this idea of natural selection, the environment, nature, having certain conditions that select for certain individuals with particular adaptations, those individuals surviving, passing on their genes, and if the environment changes, the conditions change, then the types of adaptations can evolve through time from one generation to the next. So one thing you want to keep in mind is that it is populations slash species that evolve, not individuals. Evolution occurs from one generation to the next generation. It doesn't occur within a generation. And for a trait to evolve, it's a trait that has to be found in the genes. Again, getting your finger cut off is not a trait that's found in your genes. But having 10 fingers, that's in your genes, and so that's a trait you will pass on. Does evolution shape perfect organisms? No, in a nutshell. It tends to shape organisms that are adapted to their conditions, but they're not necessarily perfectly adapted because there are always sort of limitations on how much a species can evolve. For example, people having wings might be a very beneficial adaptation, but essentially it's not in our genetic makeup to have wings. Other organisms have done that, birds and bats and butterflies and such, but our particular ancestry and lineage, it's not there, so it's not an adaptation we can have. But essentially, organisms make the best with what they have. Evolution shapes their adaptations to help them survive, and of course, if they don't survive, they will die out and go extinct. And of course, there are many extinct organisms in the fossil record who their particular form couldn't hack it and they died out. So, this idea of descent with modification. So, we have ancestors, and presumably sort of a original ancestor of all life, and through time, the descendants were modified because of changing environmental conditions, living in different habitats, and they branched off into different lineages, and then those branched off into different ones, etc., etc. So there you descend from your ancestors, but you're modified through evolutionary time. All right, I'll stop there and do the last section in a third video.